It's a bit spooky. It's a bit spooky tonight on Narrative Live. It's so good to be with you tonight as we do episode 1 of The Secret Life of Elon Musk, recording it out of Africa for reasons you will see in the next hour. I'm so glad Carrie Cookrell is here with us tonight. She is, as you know, a Silicon Valley insider, but she also has met Elon Musk. She knows a lot of the people that we may be talking about tonight, but also is very familiar with the sort of inside view of what Silicon Valley is like and what that world of technology startups are like. So, Carrie, it's so good to have you here, and thank you for taking part in The Secret Life.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Now, Elon Musk is a fascinating guy. I mean, there's no other way to describe this person. Larger than life in every regard. You know, you just simply cannot say enough good things about the man. Certainly, that's what the media likes to say about him, and for good reason, because there's just so many things that he does remarkably well. There is no shortage of superlatives for Elon Musk. He is, amongst other things, a master tweeter. If you've ever followed his Twitter feed, you'll know that. He is a smart ass by all accounts, because that's the way he treats his Twitter feed. But he's also, the apparent creator of the what we know today of the electric vehicle. Of course, he's not the actual creator, but he's certainly the proponent of it. He's an absolute babe magnet. He has 3 wives. I don't know, many wives, many children too. He's quite prolific that way too. He's a rocket man in that he's certainly one of the first people to reimagine how we use rockets and space. He was Time's Person of the Year. I've mentioned he's a daddy maker, but I'll say it again. He's also probably one of the world's smartest men, if you believe everything that we say about him, and we should. And then there's also the world's richest man, because who wouldn't want to add that as a list of wonderful things to be? He's also the advertiser, proponent of Dogecoin, one of those cryptocurrencies, and he's a big fan of cryptocurrencies. So certainly there's a lot to be said about Elon Musk that is very, very positive. I mean, there's certainly not been anyone like him, I would say, since Steve Jobs, or even maybe he eclipses Steve Jobs. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would say obviously he has an extremely dynamic and prolific career with many just skyrocketed companies that are pretty extraordinary. So yeah, it's arguably he's beyond that.
Now, lately, he's not had the best of times. I mean, certainly by his standards, he's had rough patches before, to be sure. Tesla almost didn't make it. SpaceX almost didn't make it. They did, of course, and we know that they've succeeded through the rough times that he had there. But it's not been looking so good for him lately again. And this time it's because he's facing, amongst other things, twin SEC investigations. So the Securities Commission is looking at him for insider trading. And they're looking at him for another incident, which I'm not quite sure what that is about, but nevertheless, he's under investigation. He's sort of gone to war with the SEC. Never really an advisable thing to do, but maybe in Elon Musk's world, it's something you do. He's also gone to war with the president. He sort of talks about President Biden in almost competitive terms, I would say. He certainly was upset just the other day that President Biden did not invite him to the White House. Then he was upset the week before that President Biden didn't mention Tesla as an American electric vehicle company. These are the kinds of things that children do in playgrounds when they don't get their names mentioned by their favorite teacher or by whatever. This is not the kind of thing that happens in presidential politics or on the world stage, except when it comes to Elon Musk, where it certainly is the case. And there's more to Elon Musk's sort of bad ride right now. And the biggest thing I would say that's really dogging him from my perspective, and I'm not an engineer, you're not an engineer, well, you are actually an engineer, but you're not the kind of
Yeah,
engineer who can talk
yeah.
about this particular aspect of cars and electric vehicles, is that there's this whole thing about in electric vehicle world, in EV world, about the LiDAR. The LiDAR is the way that cars are going to be able to navigate their way through the streets without crashing into things or people. And Elon Musk has bet on another piece of technology. Elon Musk has bet on technology that is very similar to the human eyesight. And all 17 other car companies have gone with LiDAR. And by all accounts, it's a far superior kind of technology. Again, I don't know for sure because I wouldn't know how to compare them, but they claim, the other 17 companies claim that it's much better technology for navigating around things and figuring out space and volume and whether you're going to crash into things. So Elon Musk has sort of shrugged his shoulders. He says, human beings don't have LiDAR. Why should your car? Who knows? He does seem to be isolated. And as this is one of the things that Tesla's always, advertised as an autonomous vehicle, it will be interesting if he doesn't have the technology to actually fulfill that promise, which is so big in his initial advertising of Tesla. There's also the hyper loop, which he finally sold to Virgin. Now that's also turned out to be a bit of a disaster. The hyperloop is now going to be looking only at cargo, not human transportation, because it just doesn't seem to be working for human transportation. They've cut half the jobs there. And then, SpaceX is probably Musk's most ambitious thing, because not only is he providing rockets for the American space system, NASA, and what have you, but he was also intending on sending these rockets to the moon and also to Mars to establish colonies there. Now, here in this article in 2017, you can see that he's promising that we'll reach Mars by 2022. And look at the calendar today, we'll tell you that we haven't been there yet. Maybe there's still time, but it's not likely we're going to be in Mars by the end of this year. So now he's stretched that out. He says within our lifetime. Some people say he says 2025, but they haven't even started testing these rockets. So you can sort of add another thing to Elon Musk's characteristics there, is that he's bold. He makes a lot of promises. He doesn't necessarily keep all of them, not 100% of them. And that sort of, makes people challenged whether to invest with him and whether to believe what he has to say. And it certainly damages his credibility. Any thoughts on all of that I just reamed out there about Elon's history?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty transparent about my opinions and my thoughts and where I'm an expert and where I'm not. And I have an engineering background. I'm not designing, LiDAR or autonomous cars. I work in the medical device industry. So these aren't areas of my expertise that I can speak to technically. And another thing, I can certainly observe what everyone else does in terms of the companies that he develops and the time tracks that he's on and the things that he promises and doesn't deliver on, as well as the things he promises and does deliver on. I think those things we can all see. I am also fairly sensitive about not commenting on his business, particularly because my issues that I've had with his related circle are very outside of business itself. So um, I'm I'm aware that sometimes people use situations as a weapon, and I'm sensitive to not doing that particularly. But in general, I agree with what you're saying, the framing, that you gave. But it's something important to me to let people know that.
Now, what you're talking about sounds really cryptic, and we will get to it. We're not going to get to it in this episode of The Secret Life of Elon Musk, but we will get to it. These are challenges you've had with people in his immediate inner circle who have been on his board for a long time and been involved in his businesses for a long time. But that really is for a later episode, because right now, tonight, we're just establishing a character here and establishing who Elon Musk really is. Now, you have met him, I think, on one occasion. What's he like?
I met him for just a handful of hours in Los Angeles at the Canadian Consulate's home, and it was for an interview that was related to the first really exposure of his detailed plans for Mars. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, am I having any technical problems? It looks like it's like
No,
breaking up
you're
a
actually
little.
you're totally fine. But who
Okay,
knows? Tonight, anything might happen, and we
okay,
apologize to the audience if it does. The way onto the show was a little tricky, so everything was had to reboot a few times. But it seems like it's stable for now, so hopefully it'll stay that
okay,
way.
okay. So if everything's fine, then yeah. So I met him then. I was connected to do an interview, and it actually was, really neat from my perspective because it was the first interview where someone um, really detailed with him the plans that he had to go to Mars, including orbital trajectories and timing and that sort of thing. He was pretty quiet. He seemed pretty nice. You know, respectful. He was very generous. This was in the end of 2013, so he was very generous with his time. We had to get a late evening meeting to even be able to get in on his schedule, and he was extremely generous with being able to sit and chat with people for a couple hours actually.
As I said, you were all good with your voice and picture, and I was told that by the audience that maybe you and I were both frozen. I'm gonna have to. I don't look frozen on my screen, And I have three of them open here, but that doesn't mean anything. So if we're still frozen, folks, if you can go to narrative.org/TV, you can join in the chat with us, and then you can tell us exactly what's going on in terms of our picture. That's narrative.org/TV, and the folks there are saying it's all good now. So thanks very much. Plus, as we go through this evening, we really want to hear your questions and any comments you have as we tell you a little bit more about what we found out about Elon Musk. Now, I'm particularly intrigued by Elon Musk because, he's South African. I spent a lot of my early years of my life in South Africa. I sort of hung around in the same place as he did. So it certainly was an intriguing thing for me to start thinking about, well, let's investigate Elon Musk. And this is just episode one of what will be a multi-part episode. Now, when we did this before, we don't know where the show is going to go. We don't know what we're going to find out. This is sort of like a real-time investigation where you and us get to do an investigation together. And we'll start off today by looking at his early history. The next episode might be something else, depending on what we find out from today and what reaction we have from tonight's show. So, pay attention, keep us involved, and let us know where you think we should be going next with the story. But first, let me take us back to the timeline here, because it is really important to establish a good timeline on these things. And there's this critical timeline, really, which is of Elon Musk's success in business, which is quite remarkable. I mean, he sort of burst into the Silicon Valley scene, if you will. Although I'm not sure it was Silicon Valley proper, but it was when he came up with Zip2, which is a company he came up with in 1995. He did not own it for very long because he sold it for $22 million to Compaq. It was a meta search company, and it turned out to be worth a lot because he invested $28,000 in it, got $22 million out of it. It's not a bad return on investment. And then by 1999, he had started the next big journey of his life, which was into this PayPal era. He had developed an online bank called X.com, and it was doing okay. It had a few, maybe hundreds, maybe even hundreds of thousands of subscribers. I can't remember, but was quite successful. But it wasn't successful enough for the era. So across the way, up the street from them, where Elon's company was, another company was being formed. And this company, I'll get the name right because I forgot it last time. Do you remember it now? It's so hard for me to remember this guy's name. Let me get it for you, folks. Company was called Cofinity. So up the street from Elon Musk's X.com was Cofinity, and it had been started by none other than Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel and Elon Musk had a meeting. They were introduced to each other in that meeting, and they decided to join together and form a company called PayPal. PayPal is a company we all know today as being massive. It was massive for them too, because within just 2 years, they sold it for a lot of money. Elon Musk got $165 million. So, again, look at that, those paydays from 1995 to 2002, we went from $28,000 to $165 million. Not shy of taking risks. The man then doubles down on everything. $100 million goes into SpaceX, which is the rocket exploration company we've been talking about. And another $70 million goes into Tesla the next year. And there's also Solar City, which is another company that he was developing. So, this is the kind of story we've gotten used to in Silicon Valley. The sort of rags to riches, impossible to believe. How could this possibly happen to these people? And why does it only happen to people like this and never people why? How do these people make so much money so quickly on these startups that, who knew that Zap2 or Zip2 or whatever it's called would be worth so much money that he could then project all that money from that into 3 more companies that were so successful. I mean, it's a success record, which is really hard to imagine, even in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. No, those obviously that's remarkable, and one has to wonder both how those people might be targeted, but also how they get where they're going.
Right. I mean, certainly it's not, to be successful once in Silicon Valley would be a huge thing. To be successful twice, even more, but to be successful so many times is pretty unbelievable. I mean, he really has not had, even though he's had failures, he's not had like a cataclysmic failure. And similarly, you look at the other big guns of Silicon Valley, the Zuckerbergs, the Jobs of the world. They're also done remarkably well in that kind of way. Peter Thiel is, of course, another one. We know Peter Thiel on this show because we spent a lot of time discussing Peter Thiel's politics and his involvement with the Donald Trump campaign, his involvement in Palantir and various other sort of, suspect companies that you well, I wouldn't say suspect, but maybe they're dubious in terms of their motivations. These are not companies that necessarily seem to have the same kind of structures of flow as other companies do. In fact, in Palantir's case, he can't get fired as the CEO. He's permanent CEO because of the way they've structured the IPO, and that's so. There's a few things that have sort of made him, sort of stand out, and Palantir is one of those companies that makes him stand out. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, he's got a few things that make him stand out.
If you think. Well, I mean, it's this whole like libertarian thing that came out of Silicon Valley was the last thing you would have expected. You would have expected that all these young up and coming people would have arrived in Silicon Valley and become ultra liberal because that just seems to make sense. Instead, they've become sort of reactionary libertarians and have pulled society away from liberalism, which is not sort of close to type. It's not what you'd expect of young people.
No, he doesn't seem on a healthy, positive track at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, that certainly doesn't. So that's Elon and Peter, and they will go into their story a little bit further, a little bit later on in the show. But I don't want to get too crowded into that story yet because there's so much more to go. But the people at PayPal, not just Peter and not just Elon, the entire structure there had remarkable success leaving PayPal. I mean, this slide sort of tells it all. It's the PayPal mafia is what they're called, and they're called that for a good reason because they have had insane success all the way through their careers, led by people like Reid Hoffman, um, and of course we mentioned Elon and Max Levchin is the other founder of PayPal. Roelof Botha, we'll talk about him a little bit later on. But these
Mhm.
are all well-known people for other things other than just PayPal, and they're all being dubbed the PayPal Mafia. Now, do you know why they're called the PayPal Mafia?
I don't exactly, except that I assume they're very, close and they have made a lot of money and, they may lack boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that they have a rule unto themselves, and they've certainly helped each other throughout the years. It's not like they've isolated each by themselves, and they've helped each other become very successful. Do they help other people? Well, that's certainly questionable. But amongst the companies that they're all involved in founding are YouTube, Postmates, Square, Palantir we mentioned already, Airbnb, LinkedIn, Uber, Pinterest, SpaceX, we mentioned Facebook, Evernote, Affirm, Solar City. I mean, these are all companies you and I use regularly. These are companies that everyone uses regularly. They're very well known entities and they really power Silicon Valley. And a lot of these same people came from working at PayPal. So it was certainly a place where a lot of talent emerged, and certainly a lot of content emerge. Yeah, Cindy's saying on the chat here, a lot of white men, mostly white men. There are some others that are not. I mean, there's Steve Chen and Yishan Wong and Jawed Karim there. I think there's some people who are not necessarily white men, but it's a lot of men, all men, isn't it? It looks like all men, and it's a certain kind of engineer type Silicon Valley man that you get. I mean, you've worked in Silicon Valley. It seems to have attracted a certain type of person.
Yeah, I actually I have worked in the medical device industry, not necessarily what one considers Silicon Valley.
Mm,
I've worked mostly outside of it, in both geographically and in the types of things that they focus on. Although, from what I understand, over the last, you know, 5 years and more, medical applications have become more pervasive in investment circles there, generally.
mhm.
Clearly, with COVID, that's the case, as well, but and digital health and that sort of thing. But yeah, I haven't actually worked in what I would consider Silicon Valley. I guess I was in Sunnyvale and a few other.
But mostly they're sort of like, they're mostly men. It's the situation
Yeah,
has improved a lot in the last few years. They used to be mostly white men and Asian men. That's also improved in the last few years, but it hasn't
yeah.
dramatically changed yet. And it's funny that not even funny. It's just sad, really, that the only big case that has come against a CEO of a company in Silicon Valley has been Theranos, which is run by a woman. In fact, it's a pretty rare occurrence in Silicon Valley. So it's probably not the most progressive of places. I guess when you put a lot of guys together in one place, they start acting like guys and thinking like guys, and maybe they come up with rationales for how they can rule the world in a guy way that just makes no sense to everybody else. But it does seem like this has been the hotbed of libertarianism, and has really sort of changed the way our American political fabric is now and forever will be.
Yeah, and just this is of an obvious statement, but a lot of the startups, they lack HR functions and like typical things that would protect medium and larger size companies from that kind of behavior set. So it seems like it just runs rampant in those circles. Yeah.
100%. And so we get to Elon Musk's family, because, we want to go to the very roots of who he is, and figure out exactly, where he came from. The story is really fascinating. His dad is Errol, and his mom is Maeve, or Maeve, in some circumstances. But they were married for a short period of time. They were only married for, I think, 9 years. But they had 3 kids, I think. Was it 3? I think it's 3 kids. Errol is interesting because, Elon does not say very many nice things about his dad. In fact, he's pretty negative on his dad. In an article in the Rolling Stone magazine, I'll just quickly show you a picture of what Errol looks like, so you can get a sense. This is Errol as he is today, and the words that I have put on top of that: he will plan evil. He will plan evil, meaning that he did plan evil. He planned a lot of evil, and Elon Musk really calls him out for it in this one article he did in the Rolling Stone magazine, where he said, but there was another side of Musk's father that was just as important to making Elon who he is. This is a quote. He was such a terrible human being, Musk shares. You have no idea. His voice trembles, and he discusses a few of those things, but doesn't go into specifics. My dad will have carefully thought out plan of evil, he says. He will plan evil, which is just, it's kind of incredible to hear someone describe their father like that. Besides emotional abuse, did that include physical abuse? This is the Rolling Stone. My dad was not physically violent with me. He was only physically violent when I was very young. Errol counted via email that he had only smacked Elon once on the bottom. Very South African terminology there. Elon's eyes turn red as he continues discussing his dad. You have no idea about how bad. Almost every crime you can possibly think of, he has done. Almost every evil thing you could possibly think of, he has done. There is clearly something Musk wants to share, but he can't bring himself to utter the words, at least not on the record. It's so terrible, you can't believe it. I was blown away when I was reading that. I mean, I've certainly heard Elon Musk be blunt about some things, but this is a whole level of bluntness, which especially about a family member, you would think it's a pretty unusual thing for him to describe his father like that. And yet, obviously, some very painful history there.
Yeah, I mean, you often hear about really high achieving individuals, and especially in the startup world, that come from extremely difficult circumstances that overcome, childhood bullying or adversity with parents. But that's certainly the most extreme I've heard, someone describe that familial relationship. But it's pretty sad to hear that, but also, probably very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. His father had a very interesting track record. I don't want to say he had a crime record because I haven't been able to find that, but he has certainly was involved in some pretty unusual things. One of them was owning a mine or partially owning a mine in Zambia, an emerald mine in Zambia. Wouldn't one like to own one of those? Must be pretty lucrative. But before we go and talk a little bit more about that mine in Zambia, I want you to play a little bit of Errol in his own words, describing Elon Musk. He was talking to a radio station I used to work for in South Africa called Radio 702. Bruce Whitfield is the anchor, and he is having a conversation with Errol about his very famous son, and it all sounds pretty complimentary. So let's take a listen to what he has to say.
He's always been a very deep thinker. When he was very small, for example, he would ask me, where is the whole world?
Good question. It's a very good question. Yeah.
I'm talking about when he was 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And these sort of questions made me realize he's a little different.
The Musk family lived comfortably in Pretoria thanks to Errol's successful engineering business and his work as a real estate developer. According to Elon, his father has an extremely high IQ and is a talented electrical and mechanical engineer. Elon benefited immensely from his father's skill. Errol used to take him and his brother Kimball to his engineering job sites where they learned how to lay bricks, install plumbing, and put in electrical wiring. It was also Errol who introduced Elon to the world of computers. When Elon was 11, he insisted that his dad take him to learn how to use the new computers that had just come out. He was far too young to attend a course hosted at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, but his dad managed to book him a spot through his engineering connections. Errol recounted what happened when Elon went to that lecture.
Anyway, he went, and I left him there, and took Kimball and I went off to get a hamburger, and we came back. It was a 3-hour-long thing at Wits, and we came back, and everybody came out, and no Elon, and we waited and waited, and then finally, went into those chilly halls of Wits, and found this sort of sloping lecture hall rather, and there was Elon with his jacket and tie off and his sleeves rolled up in his long grey flannels, 4 feet high, talking to all these blokes from England. And when I walked up to them, the one who, some professor, he didn't even bother to sort of introduce himself. He just said to me, "This boy has to have one of these computers." Anyway, we got him one of the computers, and I got it at a discount, thank God.
So that's Errol Musk talking to Bruce Whitfield of 702 in South Africa. That was my university too that I went to. There's a lot of things in Elon Musk's life that I am familiar with. I know a lot of those places, and we're not that dissimilar in age. We're just very dissimilar in our net value. I think he's he's extraordinarily more valuable than I am. But Wits was the university, as someone's pointing out in the chat, where I went to. It's very hard to say that university name, the University of the Witwatersrand. So it's shortened for Wits. If any people want to, if you have time, you research on this, search my name with Radio 702 on the internet, and you'll find all sorts of embarrassing things that I did when I was way too young as a radio DJ. But I digress. So, he doesn't sound that evil to me. He seems like he's pretty well, at least on the radio, he seems like he's pretty well measured and is very complimentary about his son. But, maybe that's now. And back then was a different situation when he was still living with him, and they'd just gone through that divorce. It was a bit messy, so who knows what was going on in Elon's life as well. He was a young teenager when he moved out.
I think it's often hard for men, particularly, to verbalize when they have experienced abuse or extremely negative things. So I would assume those are correct statements that he's making.
It's also very difficult for South African men to do this. I will say, all men are the same, but South African men, especially Afrikaans South African men, are very tough, stout, very, they don't talk about their emotions a lot, and they will bottle them up a lot, and then one day it just pops out in probably not the best ways. But these are not touchy-feely, go for therapy kind of people. Maybe today certainly things are different, but when I grew up in South Africa, the Afrikaners were a very tough crowd, and he grew up in Pretoria, which is pretty Afrikaans. It's just that it's the nature of the country and the position that we're in, I gather, that made them like that. Yeah. Jump in if you want to say anything else about that, but I think if not, we can talk about the mine.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's it.
Okay. So, go ahead.
I'm not someone who really studies Silicon Valley people. I have never read, I don't even think, one book about any entrepreneur or anything. So I'm just speaking from the interactions I've had.
What's really interesting is that Elon Musk is a voracious reader of memoirs and books about other massively famous figures. He, in fact, soaks up a lot of that information in another book, which we'll talk about a little later on. He's a big reader of how other famous people act, which I thought was kind of intriguing, because he's pretty unusual. Now, so this is the story that sort of captivates everyone, is because Elon Musk's father apparently has a big share in a emerald mine. Now, that's okay. He's an engineer. Maybe along the way he got a good deal and he became a mine owner in South Africa. Except the emerald mine isn't in South Africa. It's in Zambia, which is a little bit away from South Africa, and you have to sort of fly there. It's not the kind of place I would take my teenage son in the mid-90s or 80s on a plane that I was flying myself. But I guess Errol Musk and Elon Musk were different, because that's exactly what they did in the 1980s. They apparently wanted to take a plane all the way from South Africa, from Pretoria there, in the orange, all the way up to the top of Africa, to Saudi Arabia of all places. But then they realized that it was going to cost too much to land their plane in Mecca. So they decided to not go all the way, and they were just going to wait their time in a place in Zambia. And when they landed there, they encountered wealthy local businessmen I guess you could call it that, who owned a mine, who owned an emerald mine, and he wanted the plane. So he said, if you give me the plane, I will give you $80,000, whatever it was, or 80,000 rand, whatever, for the plane. And they said, fine. And that's in fact what happened. They sold the plane for 80,000 rand. And then the guy said to them, I'll give you half of my mine if you give me 40,000 rand back. And I guess Errol thought it was a good idea. Elon to this day claims this never happened, but clearly there was a lot of emerald mining and emerald trading going on in Errol's life, because it just pops up in many places. And that is how they became a shareholder. The Musks became a shareholder of a mine in Zambia. Now, this is an incredibly weird story to me because it's Africa and it's the 1980s and it was chaos, and the economies were tanking in all these countries. They had a huge they could the one thing that does ring true is that they had a surplus of these emeralds. They didn't know how to get rid of them because the market had crashed. But to fly your son, teenager, in your own plane into Africa would be the least likely thing I would suggest to somebody to do. I mean, anything could happen on the way there, and it would probably be not the safest thing. Obviously they became quite lucky because they were able to find this emerald miner who not only gave them a share of the mine, but was also willing later on to give them regular emeralds, which turned out to be quite valuable. So that is the emerald mine story. Although I must say, Elon does deny that this in fact happened. And I don't know how he gets to deny it, because it does seem to be verified in a lot of places. But I think what he's trying to say is that he arrived in the United States or in Canada pretty broke. Which is true. I mean, you had to. When I left South Africa, we were allowed to leave with 2,000 rand. That's all the government would let us leave the country with. And in his case, he was also allowed to leave with 2,000 rand, because that's what you got to leave. And so that's how he got to be, poor in Canada, because that's when he arrived in Canada, he was poor. So that's the story around Errol and Elon. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, you hear people often criticizing about this emerald mine. I think geopolitically, there's probably much more complicated and sophisticated commentary that can be made than what people do online and the internet when they just throw emerald mine rocks. I'm sure there's a lot more complexity involved in that situation entirely, but it just would make me wonder. People often they like to throw that stone in a strange way online, I think simply because they are not successful. So you see a lot of people, doing that. But then on the other hand, one wonders, how does someone go from nothing to the richest man in the world? What are the levers that get pulled for that to happen?
And I will say, in South Africa, for all its wealth in the 1980s and 90s, a lot of the wealth did come from mining minerals, and a lot of that mining of minerals happened in the neighboring countries. And that's why there was such interest in South Africa from around the world. And in terms of, whether apartheid stayed on or whether there was going to be a change of government there, is because it's full of so many rare earth minerals, across that entire bottom part of Africa. There's just so much that it certainly rings true that he was an engineer and that he was involved in the mining industry. A lot of people were involved in the mining industry there. The gold reserves there are incredible, diamond reserves. It's just that's how a lot of people became very rich in South Africa. So it certainly does not seem out of this world that he got that he had a share in a mine. I think what strikes me as out of this world is that he didn't know he was flying a plane there. To pay for the mine. I mean, it wasn't, we're planning a vacation, let's pop over. Accidentally I got a mine. He probably knew well in advance that that's what he was doing. He was probably flying the plane to exchange it for half of the mine. But maybe that's not legal. Maybe he was flying the plane illegally or something. I don't know. That strikes me as that's probably more realistic, which means he probably had a relationship with all the infrastructure that creates mining in Africa. Africa is not the kind of place where everything is in a straight line. You go to knock on any office and they'll give you directions on how to do things. You sort of have to, find your way to things. And in that case, you need to know people, and you need to know people who are either connected with the local mob, frankly, or the local government, or the foreign governments that are there. And, there was a lot of Chinese involvement in Southern Africa at the time, a lot of Russian involvement in Southern Africa at the time. The Germans were there as well. It is a very valuable place to go mining, and no one was going to give it up. The Israelis were there. there was just a lot of mining opportunities and a lot of profit to be made of that. So that's why the entire subcontinent was full of very many competing forces, both local and international, competing for those resources.
I mean, it sounds a lot like today anywhere in Africa, including West Africa, with China and Russia and the United States and all the countries vying for resources there. Same in Afghanistan. I'm sure anywhere there are rare earth in the world, that will be the case.
Absolutely. And especially with the dot-com boom. And we talk about, where Elon finally lands up making a lot of his money, he couldn't do it without the lithium that he needs, and he couldn't do it without the batteries that he needs to create. These are the realities of all the nice things we have in the world today. A lot of the technology, we get to use it and we get to have it because these minerals are mined in all these parts of the world, and that's where they come from. So it's not surprising to me that Elon Musk, especially if his son describes him as being a criminal, it's what I think he described me in the Rolling Stone magazine, that he would have been done some shady things to get his hands on some emeralds or what have you for his family. That does not strike me as being unusual in the slightest. I don't buy the story about let's go on a vacation to Mecca together. But, I could be wrong. Let's move on to Mom. Mom is just as fascinating. May Musk is her name. Obviously not her maiden name. There they are in more recent times in the Vanity Fair event. She has become a model. She's 70-something now, and she's always been a model, but she has become a kind of an icon for older women who model in fashion magazines. I've met her without knowing it's her, so I'll just say that out of just to be clear that I have met her, and she seems pretty interesting. Like she definitely believes that that's her place in life right now, is to be a sort of a spokesperson and a model for older women, and that is great. Nothing wrong with that, of course. What's kind of interesting about her past is her father, which is Elon's grandfather. And that takes you back to a whole different era. I'll just show you a picture of what the grandfather looks like. Can you see this? Joshua Helderman is his name. And he is there pictured with his young family. One of these little twins down in the blue dresses here, in the light blue dresses. One of them is May. I don't know which one because they're twins. So I can't tell the difference. But they are, in fact, one of them grows up to marry Errol. And in 1971, they make Elon. Now, this guy's interesting because Joshua Haldeman came from Canada. And in Canada, he was part of this movement, which is kind of fascinating. I'd not known anything about it until yesterday or the day before, and someone told me about the Technocracy movement. These are the posters of the Technocracy movement. And in the 1930s and the 1940s, this was a big deal. They wanted to turn democracy into something of the past. They were more interested in a society ruled by technicians, people who are really good at their craft, people who are interested in being experts in the field that they were, and therefore could be experts in ruling their country. And that's what they wanted to do: create these whole councils and these and a system of rule run by engineers and experts and technocrats. It's kind of a wild idea. It was kind of a wild idea to be running around with as World War II was raging, surely. And then you look at these posters, and boy, do they just evoke a certain fascist kind of feel. Plus, they look very Chinese as well. So, it's an interesting period of time in this whole movement, and it did actually do quite well. And the technocrats it became the real technocracy movement. It became quite a big thing in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, it's interesting because this movement, I only fairly recently heard about it and was kind of very unsettled by it and what I read about it and the parallels that it has to modern day things like, Tim Draper trying to break up the state of California or Steve Bannon trying to deconstruct the administrative state. I was very alarmed when I read about it. And the first thing I can think of is, Benjamin Franklin was a polymath and an inventor, a scientist, and a founding father of our country. And none of these people are Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, I think your reference there to Steve Bannon is very astute. In fact, when you really look at the core of what the technocracy movement was about, it feels a lot like modern day China, where they do sort of espouse this notion of, technical expertise leads their way in everything that goes on in China, and it's sort of engineers are highly rated, and which is nothing wrong with that. Of course, engineers should be highly rated, but they don't really have the same politics that we have here. They have a system that's built around getting shit done, if you don't mind me saying that word. And so, that's sort of where they were. I mean, I find this the post is kind of disturbing. I mean, they just look a lot like Chinese propaganda or Nazi propaganda. It looks to me like it's a swastika kind of hidden in one of these things. It's hidden, so you can't really see it, but it certainly looks like evocative of it. The main movement of the main symbol of the technocracy movement is actually the Tao. It's a circle with the two, I guess, bubbles in it. So it's yeah, it's a disturbing thing to think that this was an actual movement. It was banned in South Africa. I'm sorry, in Canada. Uh, in fact, Mr. Haldeman, that's May's father, was charged in Regina in Canada for taking part in a Technocracy Incorporated event, and that's when he decided to take his family and move him back to South Africa, which is how we got to Elon Musk. So it's fascinating to me that there is this kind of background in Elon Musk's world, because here's a quote from the manifesto of the technocracy movement. In contrast to the devious ways of politics, the fumbling methods of finance and business, we have the methods of science and technology. Modern common sense is now called upon physical science and technology to extend the frontiers of their domain. So, when you look at the kind of thing that Silicon Valley has achieved, it's a lot of the stuff that these technocracy movements would have espoused. I mean, everything from Bitcoin to all this whatever newfangled thing we've had in the last 20, 30 years. A lot of it would have been common sense, scientific evolution, and sensible things. Even Uber you can think of that as being a sort of a sensible engineered solution to a problem. In fact, everything in Silicon Valley is all about solving a specific problem, right? That's what you do when you pitch a company. You pitch a solution to a problem. So it's interesting that entire Silicon Valley seems to have come out of this idea of this technocracy movement. And then, boy, imagine that Elon Musk, who's like the poster child of Silicon Valley, is an actual a grandchild of the technocracy movement. That there's actually might be something much more fundamental in the way that he thinks about the world and about solving problems and about pushing technology the way he does than meets the eye.
Yeah, one wonders, like, when they decided to start SpaceX and, build an empire, as Tim was in his firm, or one of the, early backers of Elon Musk. Did they know that ahead of time, or did they find this out over dinner one day 10 years later?
It's a
That they
really
had this
good
common.
question. It's a really good question. He has had so much success that it belies a common sense sometimes. But maybe he's just a very, very smart dude and very, very capable dude. And in fact, that might be the case. So you've met the family. I do want to go back to PayPal, because PayPal is such a seminal event. Now, if you all use PayPal, I'm sure you use it at home. I use PayPal on a regular basis. It's a really convenient way to move money from one party to the other party. In fact, it's a little like you'd imagine Bitcoin should be. It's pretty easy to get transactions done. So it was bugging me so much that these three South Africans, because I should mention Peter Thiel. I might be a little jealous here, but whatever. I'm just going to say this. These guys are my contemporaries, and I didn't get a piece of PayPal. But there's Peter Thiel, who we've discussed before, spent a lot of time in South Africa, in Southwest Africa. His father, I believe, was also in the mining business in Southwest Africa, mining for uranium. And so it's interesting that he spent a lot of time in that same region where Elon Musk was just around the corner. And as if that weren't enough, there's a third South African involved in the PayPal mafia, and that guy's name is Roelof Botha. Roelof Botha is not just Joe Schmuck who came off the streets in South Africa. Roelof Botha is the son of the son, so he's the grandson of Pik Botha, which, if you have a memory like mine, because you were reporting in South Africa, you'll know that Pik Botha was the foreign affairs minister of South Africa towards the end of apartheid, and he was also under Mandela. He was the he's minister of mining, actually, and so Puk Botha was amongst the Afrikaners, amongst the National Party movement there. He was a really different kind of guy. He was very liberal compared to everybody else. He was less interested in entrenching apartheid. He really wanted to kind of get it over with. The guy that we always think of as Botha, the PW Botha, was the really reactionary right wing leader of the South African National Party, and he did not want to end apartheid. But Roelof here is the grandson of Puk Botha. Now, it's remarkable. I got to tell you, it's really hard to leave South Africa. It's just hard to leave South Africa because it's far away, and just becoming successful anywhere else in the world is not that easy, because you're basically coming from nowhere. Nobody knows anything about where South Africa was. So for these three guys to pack up their bags and land up coming to South Africa, to America, and becoming instantly successful in the way they did is remarkable. And the fact that they did it together is insane. And the fact that they happen to own one of the biggest .com companies ever, certainly at the time, that is actually kind of suspicious to me. That's where it begins to be a little bit, you begin to think, well, how did that happen? How did these three get together in these unusual circumstances and start this company? And there's a little bit of a clue in the way they describe the company. And back then, this is how PayPal was described by Elon Musk and company. So this is not me making up words about PayPal. This is what they described it as. Now, they have different words for it today, but back then they said it was, PayPal is committed to providing Chinese companies with world-class procurement, expenditure management, SaaS solutions. That's software as a service, I think. Expenditure to actively respond to the trend and requirements of the country's supply-side structural reforms, adhering to the concept of saving as a service through deep professional insights and leading cloud computing. This actually might be a little later, because they wouldn't have called it cloud computing back then. But still, this is their description. This is the actual official description of PayPal. And it talks about servicing China, which is interesting. Certainly very interesting that it's the main primary goal from their perspective was servicing China. Today, I'm sure you wouldn't describe PayPal as that. But the other interesting thing that was happening at this time, we spoke about how China was so involved in the mineral mines of South Africa, right? I mean, we spoke about all that lucrative rare earth material and needed to find a supply home, and these people were mining it. Where did it go? It went to China a lot of the time, because that's where they were making a lot of the technology that we all landed up consuming. The VHS tapes and the Betamax and the early Commodore 64 computers and the Ataris. They all needed this rare earth minerals, and they got them out of South Africa. So it is interesting that there's sort of an intersection between Chinese rare earth supply, the mining in South Africa, and these three guys who obviously had connections to mining in South Africa, because Elon, his dad owned an emerald mine. Peter Thiel, his father worked on a uranium mine, and Roelof Botha, his grandfather, ran all of mining in South Africa. So it certainly feels like, boy, there's something there. So what happened in March 1999 that was so curious? Why did this particular time period become a period where you might need to move a lot of money from one part of the world to another part of the world without a lot of people noticing? And the simple answer is that is when Nelson Mandela announced he was retiring. He had finished his first term in office. He was announcing that there was a second election about to take place. And the guy next to him there, Thabo Mbeki, was going to be the president of South Africa. Now, I love Nelson Mandela, like you can't believe, because he's one of the most incredible people you'll ever meet, and he's just remarkable in so many ways. He was able to unify a country, end apartheid, to change the world single-handedly. He is a singular human being that you can't really compare him to anybody else. The guy on the right, Thabo Mbeki, is not Nelson Mandela. And I know Thabo Mbeki too. He's also a really nice guy, well-educated, came from the UK, very erudite for South Africa, but definitely not the kind of leader that was going to be Nelson Mandela or anything like that. So what you landed up in is with a lot of panic in South Africa. Everybody loved Nelson Mandela because there's just one Madiba. There's no one like that. So he gave everyone a sense of confidence, and he just was able to serve as just one term as president, which is obviously a real shame for the country, because after Thabo Mbeki came Zuma, and the whole place went into a mess. But my point there is that there was a lot of panic at the time, and that led to, and I just know this from my own personal recollection, to a lot of capital flight from South Africa. There was, I think if you look at this chart, a couple of points where it was up at 15 to 10% of GDP between 1987 and 2000. So a lot of money just leaving the country. At some point, I think someone had done a calculation that was like almost $300 billion, which is, South Africa is this tiny country in Africa that didn't have that many resources to be flowing out. And certainly if you're a white South African at the time, you were trying to move your money out of the country. It was what people were doing because they were worried about the future.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that right around this time comes these three South Africans with a company called PayPal, which is known for moving money around the world sort of seamlessly. And at the time actually had a huge fraud problem. It was really difficult at the time for the folks at PayPal to follow all the transactions. There were so many. Their things were just getting labeled whatever they got labeled. They didn't know how to count for all the stuff. They had no idea the people were moving drugs or money or whatever through their system, and it became a big problem for them later on, which they then attempted to sort out. But
Sounds
at the
like
time,
Silk Road before Bitcoin.
yeah, right. It's a lot like, where's Bitcoin regulation right now? Because
Yeah.
we need it right now, because guess what's happening with Bitcoin is the same thing probably likely happening with PayPal, and there's no surprise that Elon Musk is a huge supporter of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So this when I realized this today or yesterday, I was like, holy moly, look at this chart. I'm not saying these guys were doing anything untowards or illegal. We couldn't say that, but they may have inadvertently facilitated something. Maybe not so inadvertently facilitated big transfers of cash, certainly around the world, but also out of South Africa at a very interesting time. Now, I didn't know about PayPal back then, but I bet you they knew people who knew about PayPal because they would tell them about that. So,
Mhm.
it wasn't that easy to get money out of South Africa back in the 2000s or before 2000. So
Yeah.
that's the whole thing I think about PayPal. I mean, I haven't seen this anywhere else. So this is a lot of my adding 2+2+2+2, but it does seem to add up to me.
Yeah, no, it's a remarkable graph, and it certainly reminds people of situations that are happening all over the world today. There's a balance of human rights, and the people who suffer when there are sanctions are often, just the people that live in a country, not the people running the country. So, but on the other hand, there's an extreme amount of corruption and crime and money laundering that happens, and the balance of dealing with those two things doesn't look great in things like Silk Road. So I can imagine at an early day of this that it was mayhem.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not to take away from these three really brilliant gentlemen who did a lot of wonderful things and clearly still do. There's a piece of this that seems to be unknown and needs to be more investigation. There was certainly a lot of dirty money that flowed through PayPal, a lot of it, and not knowing where it came from even until this day is challenging. But I also think we can't allow history to repeat itself, because, as you point out, crypto is here. It's doing exactly the same thing. It's got this giant sucking sound that's pulling dollars out of the American economy daily. Millions and millions and millions of dollars are being sucked out of America. We don't know where it's going, because it's
Yeah.
an unfamiliar system and because it's unregulated. And while we sit around here and try to figure out, hey, let's how do we regulate this stuff? Maybe we should just not have it because it's not good for us, and it's probably taking a lot of money away from the country at a time when we really need it. So yeah.
Well, and it also is extremely unsettling the fact that Tim Draper, who is the early and continued proponent of Elon Musk, the only person he seems to defend more than Elizabeth Holmes is the founder of Silk Road.
Right, which was really interesting, isn't it? And the
Yeah.
countries are all involved in all of these. It's not, when you look at who was behind the coding, the engineering of X.com, which is Elon Musk's company. A lot of Chinese engineers there. There were some Ukrainian engineers, some Russian engineers involved with Peter Thiel. It's the Israelis sort of had their fingers in there somehow. I'm sure. It's just it's not hard to see that it's the same countries doing the same things over and over again. And
Right.
maybe they have reason to, but our job here is to make sure that you know about them, and that we try avoid making these same mistakes again, because it certainly seems to me like whatever South Africa was going through in the 80s and 90s is very similar to what the United States is going through right now, and certainly what democratic nations around the world are facing, and we should learn from that, because there's lots of lessons there.
Yes.
Carrie, thank you for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Next time you're going to get to talk a lot more than me, because we've got so many other things to talk about. But this is a good first take at the secret life of Elon Musk. This will be an occasional series. So I don't know when the next episode is going to come, but you can sense that there is a lot of fertile ground in Elon Musk's life, and we have lots of leads. You might have more leads you want to share with us. We're going to keep looking at who this guy really is. Who is he, and how did he achieve all the wonderful things that he's achieved? And is he acting in our best interests? All of that will be revealed in future episodes of Narrative TV. Thank you for being here tonight, everybody. And thank you, Carrie. And have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.